morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Andile Nongogo, the CEO of NSFAS. I think at the outset, I want to start off with an apology. One, for starting later than we had planned to. I also understand that we had communicated some dates previously that we could not honor. We know that a whole lot of you were eager to hear where NSFAS stands. So I'd like to start with that and echo the same words as my colleagues and say we appreciate that you have come to this session. My CIO is a man of words. He uses a lot of words. I think in his spare time he's a preacher, so he gets lost. Simplify the purpose of today. We are here to take you through, firstly to confirm, let me even start there before I go to all the nitty-gritties, that NSFAS is taking over the management of accommodation for its beneficiaries. That's the first thing we are here to confirm. Secondly, we are then here to take you through the process of how that process is going to work. And at that also take you through the system in case you have some system issues. Summary of it is that this is why we are here today. Now, before I get into my address, maybe, in fact, let me say, as I get into my address, firstly, all of us, I hope, we have an understanding of what NSFAS is and what it stands for. NSFAS is a scheme that exists to provide opportunities at a higher education level for those poor students who would not otherwise been able to have that had it not been for this government intervention. That's what we exist for as NSFAS. In there, it's highlighting that we represent a particular group of students. NSFAS represents students who would not otherwise been able to afford to get to higher education, but through this government intervention, they are able to. So simply put, we represent poor students. These beneficiaries of ours and these students ultimately go and contribute to the economy. It's not just that they fund, they study forever, they must actually ultimately go and contribute. Now, for them to go and contribute, it would mean that they have to succeed in their studies. There's a part they have to do as students where they have to study and make sure they succeed. Ours is to provide an environment, an enabling environment for them to actually succeed. Now, there's a link between a student well-being, where a student stays, and ultimately the ultimate result of that student. Now, we then must understand the role you play as accommodation providers. It's not just simply a role of there's a space, there's a bed where a student must go, but the space has to be conducive for a student to study so that they ultimately are able to succeed. And I'm broadly saying a student, but the more focus of NSFAS. So when I say student, I want us to understand me to say today an NSFAS beneficiary. But it applies to all other students, but the focus of our discussion is on NSFAS beneficiary. So I thought it's important that we understand. The second thing I want to touch on is just the background. I'm sure that some of us sitting in the room, in fact, I should have started by saying, by show of hands, how many of you in the room were once funded by NSFAS? I'm sure, if I'm to speculate, at least 50% here would say that they were maybe funded by NSFAS. Now, the reason I'm saying this, you would understand the challenges that our students go through in terms of the student accommodation process. We, firstly, starting where I think is important for you, because yes, some of you will argue with us and say, you are here, you are doing this for the passion of it, for the love of it, because we want to contribute. But beneath that, we know that there's an economic drive for you to get into this. Now, one of the challenges with what has been happening here is an issue of inconsistency on the costs. The approach of NSFAS, in fact, let me not say yes, the approach of NSFAS, let me take accountability for this one, was that we would pay for private accommodation the highest cost of an institution-owned accommodation. That is one of the challenges. Now, what does this mean in simple terms? You have two institutions in Joburg as an example. Even before we include TVET colleges, you've got VETS, UJ. The highest cost of accommodation in VETS, as an example, let's say it's 70,000. The highest cost of accommodation in UJ, I said VETS first, right? UJ is 60,000. Now, one student gets 60,000, the other gets 70,000 as a maximum. But they are yet in the same city competing for the same accommodation. There was inconsistent application between what was applied for university students vis-a-vis TVET college students. TVET students were allowed a maximum of 33,000, and yet they live in the same cities. They must compete for the same accommodation at 30,000. Challenge number one. Challenge number two, I'm not going to list all of them, so don't worry. I'm just going to take on the highlights. Challenge number two, as a result of this, that you're allowing this maximum for students. In fact, the other challenge is that this allowance for private accommodation is given to a student in cash. Now, what does a student do in collusion with some of you? Is they'll say, I am allowed this maximum, but I know you're costing your accommodation at this much. Pay me the difference. Or in fact, we go further and say, let's split the difference. That's another challenge that we're facing with the current, with the things the way they were before. The other one is where there's even collusion. The first collusion is with the student, but the collusion is also with the landlord themselves. In this area, as these landlords, this is how much we are going to charge. Regardless of whether the cost is warranted or not. Maybe sometimes it is. The biggest of all, I'm not going to list them. The biggest challenge is that many of the places, in fact, maybe let me even say this. We know that there are some fraudulent practices at institutions where people pay certain amounts for certain of their accommodation to be accredited, whether it meets or not, by the way. If you are not participating in that, your accommodation, even if it does meet, might not necessarily be taken. Most of all is where places are not conducive to study, are not conducive for students to be there. And yet students are being placed in such accommodation. So these are some of the challenges that I just want to touch on that were there. You know, if many of you would say that sometimes there's also been this misconception that there is a thing called NSFAS accreditation. This is before we said we would do accreditation. NSFAS has never in its life accredited accommodation. That was institution accreditation. So what I'm trying to say, the biggest challenge is that NSFAS spends approximately 13 billion is what we spent last year on accommodation. And yet we have no say. We have no say on how this money is spent, where it is spent, and so that is why, amongst all the other reasons I've mentioned, we then took a decision, a policy decision was taken that NSFAS is going to be involved in the processing of student accommodation for its beneficiaries. So that is why NSFAS is involved in the student accommodation. Now, I've spoken to the why. Maybe just to be clear, the why you are getting involved is one, to make sure that our beneficiaries stay in conducive accommodation. What we also don't know, what I didn't say is that already there is more demand for accommodation than there is supply. So we are getting involved to see if there are ways and mechanisms for us to make sure that there is more capacity for our beneficiaries as NSFAS. That is the second reason why we are getting involved. Third reason is value for money. You know, in the higher education sector, NSFAS funds 66% of the student population roughly, which therefore say that we fund the majority and therefore we should be in a position to dictate terms of what we are willing to pay, what we are willing to pay for. That's how markets work, isn't it? So part of it is to make sure that there's value for money. But the most important of all, we also have on the one hand an increasing number of students, beneficiaries who want to access higher education. We know that the fiscus cannot be able to accommodate virtually everybody with fiscus constraints. And therefore we have to put controls in place to make sure that we manage the little resources that we have. That is the why NSFAS is involved. Maybe the other reason is that when anything goes wrong, most of the time, it is NSFAS who has to answer what has gone wrong at a place of accommodation. Was this place conducive? Was it not conducive? And all of that. So that is the why we are going to get involved. Now, the how is the next thing then. How are we getting involved as NSFAS? We've looked at this thing in terms of, I look at it as, we look at it as three broad categories. One, we want to be involved in the administration of student accommodation. And this is where ultimately the purpose of today is going to focus on. Meaning, how do we make sure that we have people come to apply to us that want to provide accommodation? How do we then process those applications for accreditation? How do we grade this accommodation such that we know we are paying the right amount? 4, how do we then link accommodation providers and students? Which will ultimately mean that NSFAS then is in a position to get into direct contracting with accommodation providers. And ultimately, which means we are then the ones who are going to sign lease agreements with the accommodation providers and ultimately pay directly to the accommodation providers. That is the administration side, you know. I'm sure they'll take us through how the portal works and what it's done. So that's the administration side of how we are going to do this. The second part of NSFAS involvement is one that says, we understand that, as I indicated, there's less stock available to the demand, meaning we don't have enough beds to cover not just our beneficiaries, there's just not enough beds for all the students. So the second then involvement of NSFAS is to say, using the fact that we fund 66% of the students, we spend 13 billion or more on accommodation. How do we then create an enabling environment for those that want to develop these accommodations to get some certainty. Now we are doing this through off-take agreements that we are getting into. We are exploring discussions around the PPP arrangements and so forth. That is the second how as NSFAS. The third one is that we all know that for any accommodation to be used for housing students, that obviously it needs to meet the minimum norms and standards, hence the accreditation process. But we also realize that many of our campuses are either in townships, are either in villages, and so it would be unrealistic of us to think that overnight such places would be able to meet the accreditation requirements. And so it becomes a question of how do we then make sure, because the one thing that is important, that is a certainty, is that accommodation has to meet the minimum norms and standards for students to be housed there. That one is clear. But how do we then also create an environment where we are assisting those that are in the student accommodation? I'm now talking particularly those that are sometimes loosely called backrooms. How do we make sure that they meet the standard? And so part of the intervention there is, again, we also have to understand the profile of the people that provide such accommodation and the areas where this accommodation is. Because even if we said to those people, we want you to meet the requirements, minimum norms and standards, tomorrow they will not be able to. They will not even be able to access the funding that is required to do so. Hence, then we are saying we are in discussions with the Department of Small Business, in particular CFA, to create a fund that will assist these people to meet the standard, so that then there is more conducive accommodation for our beneficiaries. Now, there are byproducts which are not necessarily what we were really intending. The byproduct of all of these interventions that we are doing is that, aside from the obvious, that there will be conducive accommodation, that there will be more accommodation, but the byproduct is that as part of this, there's going to be township and rural economy revitalization. Perhaps there's going to be towns that are known to be student accommodation towns, creating economies as a result of that. So there are some byproducts that are going to come. Now, of course, we've engaged with institutions with the view of not destabilizing the sector when we start, and we had said to institutions, when we are going to do the full and wholesale takeover, we are going to give institutions 3 months notice. But it doesn't mean that we are saying we are not taking over accommodation now. Yes, we are going to give 3 months notice to say we are taking over. Now, the important thing is that anyone who's interested in providing accommodation for NSFAS beneficiaries needs to go through the NSFAS accreditation process. Well, as I said, institutions, we know they cater for self-paying students that are funded by other funders. But what we are talking about is for NSFAS beneficiaries. If your accommodation is designed to cater for NSFAS beneficiaries, then you have to go through the NSFAS process. Of course, we do not want to reinvent the wheel and duplicate the work was done. To the extent that we are satisfied on an accreditation process that has been followed by an institution, we will then rely, of course, having done some desktop review on the work that was done, so that we do not start from a zero base. So policy decision number 1 is NSFAS is going to be involved. 2, that we said we are going to allow institutions 3 months notice before we do a full takeover. Third decision is that the maximum NSFAS is willing to pay this year, as stated in the guidelines for accommodation, is 45,000 per annum. That is the maximum. Doesn't mean that everybody now all of a sudden must charge 45. How we are going to determine how much we are willing to pay is going to be based on grading. You can put up your accommodation for 45,000. Doesn't mean we are going to take it at 45 if we grade it differently. We are not going to be, so the cap is 45,000. We all understand as business people the concept of willing buyer and willing seller. If your accommodation is priced higher, we are not the market for you. There's a market for that. We simply cannot afford anything above 45,000 as NSFAS. And we accept that there are some that are going to withdraw their properties because they're more expensive. We accept that. In the same way we accept that there's going to be more who are going to provide accommodation at the level at which we want it. And this is evidenced by some of the applications that we've received. Even on the off-take agreement call that we've done, we're very clear. Your property is above 45,000, don't apply for an off-take, you are not going to get it. Which clearly signals the intention of where we want to go. Now already I can tell you, we are sitting with a minimum of 573,000 beds that are applied through that. So which means we will get the capacity. So that is policy decision number 3, pertaining to student accommodation. That our cap is 45,000. So I thought, as I then hand over to the COO to take us through the process of what we are going to do, that it's important that we understand where NSFAS stands as far as student accommodation is concerned. Now, there's this misconception, sometimes it depends. I must maybe address this against my better judgment. There's this misconception that there's a certain grouping of accommodation providers that we want to do away with, that our approach is intended to marginalize those up-and-coming accommodation providers, that we are pro this, we are pro that. All what we are interested in as NSFAS is that there is conducive accommodation for our students. We also understand that many of our campuses are in the rural areas, and therefore we have to make sure that they meet the standard. As a byproduct, we want to then make sure that we assist those that provide such accommodation to meet the standard. And of course, I don't even want to start sounding like a politician because I can never be one. It's also an important thing that as part of what we are doing, we are also hoping to transform the industry in a manner that there's more participants in the industry. But ultimate goal is to make sure that our students have conducive accommodation. The ideal state for this intervention as NSFAS is that when a beneficiary gets an approved from NSFAS that you are approved for funding, they should not be going to Pretoria for the first time in their lives, having left their villages with no certainty of where they are going to stay. They should know living there that I have a place to stay, even if that place to stay is temporarily, to say, I'm only here just to look for accommodation, to look for a place at an institution. We want to provide them that certainty that you'll be allowed some minimum days to do that, and then ultimately you sign on and then you stay there Of course, what I'm saying requires commercial discussions with yourselves as to how we make that possible. Now, colleagues, that is what, and we thought it was important to this workshop to be clear about why we are involved, and also to clarify, because we understand that some institutions have been saying to accommodation provider, don't bother about NSFAS. They are not going to start this now. NSFAS is going to start this now. Yes, people may say that, well, what does NSFAS know about accommodation? Maybe you don't even have your other processes correct. Sure, that's fine. But ultimately, we are going to start this thing, we are going to do it, and we are going to do it right. Now, on that note, as to saying we are back, I thought it was just important for me to lay the understanding so that as we continue with today's discussions, we have clarified some of these key issues in as far as we are concerned. But as I said, the ultimate aim of today is to talk about how do we navigate the portal, how do you apply, and all those processes. That is really the process of today.
To sing Pahlel, and in NSFAS I'm responsible for business operations. I think in his opening remarks, the CEO covered quite sufficiently the reasoning, the policy, and why we are doing this. So I'm not going to dwell onto that. I think it's been well covered. What I just want to touch on is to just make sure that we all understand what we are trying to solve for as an entity, because all of us sitting here today, we have chosen to participate and to support the National Student Financial Aid Scheme in delivering its very tough mandate. So it's very important that all of us understand what that is. So we are an entity under the Department of Higher Education and Training, and all of our funding comes from the department. And the department is very prescriptive in terms of who the NSFAS funding must go to. And I want to emphasize that point very clearly. They say to us, you are to administer funding for poor and working class families that come from a household that earns no more than 350,000 per annum. When you look at that, we're serving the poorest of the poor. When we also take into account that students that come to NSFAS, that come from this household, that is not the only student. That is not the only child. There's many other competing priorities in that household. But what government is trying to do is to make sure that it changes the lives of our poor working class by making sure that it opens up access to higher education. So we have a huge responsibility, and you are also now going to be partaking in that huge responsibility. So we need to understand it for what it is, and we need to understand the type of the student that we are going to be dealing with. So what do they get? They get the full cost of study, they get their tuition paid for, they get their accommodation, they've got other allowances, so that it's all covered for by government. It's not a lot, it's minimal. And the reason why we are getting into this intervention is because some aspects of the cost of study has gone exorbitantly high unchecked, and accommodation is one of those. And it makes the scheme now to become totally unsustainable. If one element of the cost of study is unregulated, That is why in the policy, you see the CEO says, this conversation today is not to discuss policy aspects. Policy has been set, it's been done, it's cast in stone. The accommodation allowance is 45,000 per student per annum. That is the understanding, right? So it's very important. Now, again, going back to the NSFAS student, as an entity, we have set ourselves on a different path to make sure that the experience of this poor student is an experience that helps them to succeed in higher education and training. Most of us that studied through government bursaries, it would have been the first time when we got to institutions of higher learning that we experienced to have a bed of our own, to shower properly, to eat properly. And we expect the same from all of us. Because as a poor student coming from a village, I cannot come and relive the same where government is covering this cost so that I can succeed in higher education. So that is the appeal. That is the appeal, that we have to be very cognizant of the type of student we're dealing with. We have to nurture that student. We have to make sure that the services that we provide in our accommodations are the services that help our students to succeed. We have had this process implemented by institutions of higher learning for the longest of time. And we are very much alive to the problems that our students are facing in some of the accommodations. In some of the accommodations that are so demeaning, that are really not conducive to help government to realize the objective of making sure that access to education and success in higher education is realized for this majority of people that are poor. So I think this is very important for us to understand. So as we develop our accommodations, we have to have that in mind. We have to put it at the back of our mind that the cost is limited. What types of the services? We have to work with the minimum norms and standards. What can we do? How can we assist the system to make sure that we all work towards the goal that can be realized? A lot of problems from accommodation providers is, when do you pay? When do we know that students are going to be paid? Students come at the beginning of the year. In institutions of higher learning, they sit with resources. When students come, they accommodate them, they give them food, they make sure that students are settled. What is going to be our plan? We need to work a process that supports students alongside the infrastructure part of it. There is a life that we have to think about that is going to be the beginning of the year. What will our support structure look like while we wait for all this compliance process for NSFAS to happen? NSFAS is a very compliance-driven process, extremely compliance-driven. Every student that is disbursed or paid to is a student that has gone through this process. So again, the emphasis that was made was, we are now here narrowing our definition to the NSFAS approved funded student. So how we need to work our process with you is to be so tight in communication of process and systems that you so much understand the NSFAS process and your touch points. Because the point that we'll start talking to you is when now we are here at this point. So, but you do realize all of that happens for our students. At that stage, when we are about to disburse, there's a number of things. We've seen that this student is that student, which the policy said must be from this type of household. We've ticked all the boxes that student complies. that student is registered at an institution and we have confirmation that they are registered, and therefore we have approved them, and we can say, you student, please go check out this accommodation, that accommodation, because you will know from us who are the students that are approved. We will give you the students that are approved. We will not have you take any student come and then get hit with a bill that here's your students, that we don't know where those students are coming from, right? Again, being a government entity, our money comes in tranches from government, right? So we get funding in April, we get funding in June, September, and like the end of the year. You need to be understanding that at some point we'll come to you to negotiate, to say, can you keep them? It's a conversation that we will have with you, because you need to know about it now and decide whether you still want to be part of this arrangement or not. Because we will come to you and say, look, we're still busy with this process. We are still waiting for institutions of higher learning to tell us who are the students that are registered. But these ones, they were there last year. Can you now please take these ones at least for just 2 weeks while we complete all our process? That's a conversation that we're going to have with you. And all of that conversation happens within the limitations that we have already explained of funding cap, and trying to make sure that we still provide our students with the best service that we can afford. So I think it's very, very important to understand the whole funding cycles, and also know that we can only now start engaging yourselves when we have a full confirmation of who is the NSFAS funded students. And then we can then communicate with you. We are happy with the students, we will direct the students to you, and then we'll also break down the types of students that we expect you to work with. So this is our students. You probably have worked a lot with our university students. In the university environment, we have our first time entering students. These are kids that were in matric last year, and they have been accepted at institutions of higher learning to study. This is the most vulnerable of our cohort of students. And you will have realized, probably most of you that worked with institutions, that they pay special attention to these first-time students, because they don't know. They are transitioning from some other area, first time in big city, can't figure out where to go, how to go, and they find themselves somewhere in Soweto, Kokahabome, and not knowing how to figure out where to get to UJ. What kind of student life services are we going to put in place to orientate our students? I agree, we are in this accommodation business to help students, so we cannot just provide a house and stand back, because our business is students. So we have to take interest in the life of the students and draw those dots between when they enter the accommodation and when they are in class, and have interest in after class activities. So we have to have a program that focuses on what else can we do to support student life, and as much as we are providing them a bed and a desk and whatever else is required by the norms and standards to study. Because the one big issue that we need to all be mindful of as issue of security is issue of security for our students. How safe are our spaces? We cannot afford to have those incidences where our students are, the victims of whatever kind of violences. We have to be protective of our student accommodation enterprises. We have to compete to be the best amongst ourselves. We have to compete to be that place where the student wants to stay at because they feel safe. They can go to Bani, and they are safe, they feel safe. And they feel that this environment allows them to study. So in both university and TVET colleges, we have our first-time students. So our ask is, please have a program of how you're going to support our entering first-time students that are coming into your residences. How are the students going to be assisted to transition in wherever the environment that they are finding themselves in, because that is what institutions provide. Remember now, we are competing with institutions, right? So why would we go away from institutions and still get more of the same or even not worse? So let's please have programs to support students. We have disabled students that we are funding as NSFAS, disabled students from the TVET college sector, disabled students that are studying at universities. How do we support our disabled students that in the event somebody that walks through your residence is a disabled student, how are we going to know? How are you going to make sure that we have such a tight relationship of support to this student and that in any way they don't feel like they are disabled and they are not supported to pass? So really this aspect is saying, yes, we are going to zoom in on the system part of things, go through how we're going to all list our properties, accredit them and get everything right, checks, all of that. But in all of that, there's a life that we also need to think about and have a supplementary process that assists our students to succeed. And then lastly, this is the part that will be demonstrated through the system. The CEO in his remarks spoke about our value proposition and is anchored on what you're seeing on this slide. We are trying to really assist and open up the market as widely as possible, given the demand and the challenges that we are facing to accommodate all our students. Our student population for university, NSFAS funded students, is just about over 500,000, and our TVET college students is almost close to the same number. And I think the demand for them it's more than enough it's been over-analyzed. There's so much demand for the students to be properly accommodated. So in terms of the student numbers, I don't think we are wanting of student numbers. And the policy landscape is also ripe to accommodate both TVET and university in the similar way, as opposed to previously where there were limitations of policy in terms of how we support students at TVET colleges. So the portal that will be demonstrated after we take a short break is really targeted at yourselves as accommodation providers. I believe by now you have already gone through the portal, you know what works, you know what doesn't work, but nonetheless, we'd like you to run through it again together with you. And as we do that, if you can then please note the questions or the issues that you have already picked up as you engaged with the portal, because this is a new system. Let's then see what are those issues, and if there's a need for us to fix anything, then we'll go and do those minor changes. But you'll be able to be taken through the whole application process and the uploading of documents as accommodation providers, the creation of student residences and rooms, how that looks like on the system. You will view your application status as an accommodation provider. You will also be able to view an appeal where your accommodation has gone through the process, has been rejected, and then you'll know what process then do I follow to appeal in case you have fixed something that they said, no, this is not working. Now I'm ready, can I appeal and re-upload? Upgrade approved residences. The one thing that we're getting a lot of feedback on is the issue of the cap, and also when we visit institutions and for both institutional residences as well as private accommodation residents, it's an issue of the quality that is being provided. And this process also is intended to help the upgrading of residences so that we can begin to build stock that is compliant. You can view and action applications, the student details, as NSFAS would have given the students to go on that portal, check the accommodation that is available, choose the ones that you like, and then we should be able then to generate a contract once the students accept your residence and you accept that student, and then we have a relationship with yourself and not with the student. This is really to try to mitigate the risk previously where NSFAS, we paid the student and then the student gets into the residence, the student runs away or changes that. So we're trying to also try to manage that relationship very closely. And therefore we are in a position to sign the lease with you. Hence, I'm saying upfront that we are in a position to also negotiate where we have challenges. We do have challenges when government doesn't give us money on time. And that means that is, if you note it as a risk, it is a risk that you need to provide for in your business planning processes. So I thought, let me cover that aspect. And then in terms of the student will be able to view the listing of residences for the same institution. So remember I said, once we have confirmed the students in the previous slide and they're registered, we're going to send the information to them to say, go to the portal, see what is there on the portal. So they will be able to apply and they will be able to assist us to know that they confirm that we can sign the lease agreement with you. But again, it would allow them to log cases. So in one area that we visited, it turned out the facilities were accredited perfectly in compliance with the norms and standards. For that very purpose of accreditation, they were compliant. And students came back to say 3 weeks later, the beds have gone, the fridges are gone, there's no more desk. What replaces is a concrete bed. I'm not talking about things that are not existing, it's reality. So we provide for the student to log cases where all that fittings that was there when the accreditation happened all of a sudden have disappeared. And we also give you an opportunity to also respond, to tell us, no, actually they are there. Oh, no, they had gone for fixing, they are back. Oh, no, the student have broken them. So we will be able to see what is happening in the residence as far as the life of the students. Even incidences, as I'm saying, of, well, Wi-Fi, it's been 3 months since we have no Wi-Fi. We are now buying electricity. These are real stories that students are telling us. We hope they don't happen in this region. Okay, I'm gonna skip the institution but what I just want to say in relation to institutions, most of you have worked with institutions. Please help us. Separate the institution process and the NSFAS process. This process that is driven by NSFAS, deal with this process with NSFAS and NSFAS students. We're getting a lot of feedback around, I've already paid the institution. We really have no business in interfering in what you have already done with institutions. That has never been our responsibility. This process starts here and now this year for NSFAS. So please, let's have that understanding that we can only raise queries on NSFAS as far as this process is concerned to NSFAS, not what has been done with institutions who has paid what. So that doesn't belong here. Here we're going to start a new process with ourselves together. What doesn't work here, direct it rightfully so to NSFAS, and then let's build that relationship going forward. Anything inherited from the institutions, I think those are conversations that you need to have with those institutions as you either wrap up with the institutions if you intend to wrap up or completely launch onto the NSFAS, because the intention of NSFAS is to take over completely the accommodation process for NSFAS funded beneficiaries, understanding that institutions that have other non-NSFAS beneficiaries. So the choice is there. Should you choose to work with institutions on non-NSFAS funded students. But for the NSFAS funded students, in a short space of time, when we have completely verified, build enough stock, that process will be run entirely by NSFAS.
We're going to do a demo for you on how you're going to do the registration. And then after that, I'll take you through how you can list your property as well as the accreditation process. A quick one, I'm going to use the test mode for us. But I think you are required to use the correct websites and go to the correct links in order for you to do the registration and carry through the whole process. So meanwhile, just for some of you that may not be able to get to the links, but I think most of you are able to, like myself, I like Googling, so I would Google the NSFAS student accommodation provider. Then I will have links which I can go to. So just to follow through the process. All right, so to do the registration, once you land on this page here, you need to complete with the right information. And in order for you to do that, it's to ask you of the right information. You need to go to create account. So once you create your account, on this page it will ask you to choose the registration type. At the moment, the only active registration we have is accommodation providers. The moment we're gonna be onboarding students will also be available here. So at the moment, we are dealing with accommodation providers and we choose accommodation provider. Now, interestingly, we have a number of accommodation provider types, and you'll be required to choose the kind of accommodation provider that you are. Are you an agent? Are you an individual company, government entity, or a traditional entity? So for the sake of this one, I will use company. So under company, what you'll be asked is to enter the company details. So in my case here, so my company, for example, I choose TKM. Now, we know that a company must be registered, so we'll be required to enter a registration number. And in my case, I'm going to use 2011/ just dummy details, okay? My apologies, let me take out the other slash. All right, so that's my registration. There comes a very critical moment where we need now to have our contact number. In this case, we'll be required to choose our contact number. Then the next thing is I'm supposed to enter email address. Please bear in mind that in your situation, make sure you use the correct cell phone number because that is very crucial. The second thing is your email address must be correct because these ones are the ones which we are going to use to communicate with you. That is the passwords, the communication OTP pin, any communication from NSFAS will go through these two contact details. Now here I'm required to enter my password, and my password is, I'm just going to put that password for me. And then the next thing that I'm supposed to enter here, it's asking password weak. Please enter alphanumerical special symbol also needs to be used in this case. So it's warning me that my password that I've entered is weak, and therefore I need to enter a password that is strong enough so that someone cannot hack into my password. Okay, so I'm going to change this one. All right, so here automatically I'm told my password is strong, and please take note of this communication we put here. This is regards to the email and the password that we are using. So I'm going to say, yes, I understand, but make sure that you go to the terms and conditions, you read them and you understand them very carefully. And then the next thing you need to validate yourself that you are not a robot. So in this case, I'm validating myself that I'm not a robot, and once that is done, I'm going to go, please create my account. All right. Now here comes the moment of truth. This moment is where now you need to validate the 2 OTP pins. You may have different mode depending on what you receive, but what is critical here is that you need to enter the OTP pin that you have received by your cell phone, as well as the OTP pin that you have received by email. This is to make sure that we have the right contact details, and in that case we should be able to reach you, and we are validating the correct information of the individual that is registering or the company that is trying to register in our case. So let me simply access that. I just want to get the details so that we can get through. But for you it will be simple because it will come straight into your emails and into your respective cell phone by email or by SMS. So I obtained my codes here, and these are the codes that I'll be required to put in here. So let me go ahead and put those 2. So I've entered my codes in there, and I'll go ahead and validate my account. So the moment I'm validated, it will automatically log me into the system, and that authorizes me now to be inside my account. Now, once you enter in here, you will see that some information are not provided. So you'll be required to make sure that you complete your profile by uploading the necessary information as well as attachment of the documents that are required. So meanwhile, I'm just going to show you where you can update your information more. If you come here, you can update with more information regarding your account. So you can add all the things that are required for you, and once you have completed and you are happy, you can go ahead to say list your space. Listing your space is now where we are listing our property, in which case now we're saying, okay, I've got the following property and I would like my property to be used for student accommodation. Now, the steps that you follow from here are very simple and straightforward. And actually, we have tried our best to make sure that it provides you with the best and also simplified experience. What we require from you is accommodation name, accommodation type of ownership of the property, the address, and then we now asking for the details of the rooms which are available at that particular property. So under here, we have 2 which are very critical that we need to understand. We have the space type. Space type is where now we need to choose whether our property has got identical rooms or the property has got mixed types of rooms. We may have maybe single beds, or we may also have 2-bed kind of room in our property. So let's go ahead, before maybe some of us will focus on information, let's go ahead and put up something here. So in my case, I'm just gonna put up something that can give us get to good going. First of all, I'm going to put elite properties. That is the type, that's the accommodation name, that's what it's called. Then here it gives me a drop down. What type of accommodation is this? Is it a home residence, or is it a private home residence, or is it a private rented accommodation, or is it just an apartment? So in this case, for example, I'm gonna choose that one. Then type of ownership is either owned or leased. So maybe I'm going to say I own this building, and then I'm going to put up an address. I'm just going to get an address just for simple. And the one that I'm going to use is 1 Ethel Avenue. Now we need to enter the rooms. First of all, we need to choose whether this is standard. And if it's standard here, it will ask us what is the room types which we have. this one is single, for example. And then in here we are saying how many rooms do we have? I'll put 100, for example, okay? Now we proceed, say if I have 100 and they are single, automatically the number of beds, we assume they are 100 as well. Now the double, in this case, they are single beds, all right? Now, the number of bathrooms. I think according to the Roman standards, it defines very well how many number of bathrooms are supposed to be there, but a specific number of beds. All right, so just for this demonstration, I'm going to choose 7. And then here it's asking me, say, where am I providing this accommodation? We are asked here to provide the institution where we will be providing this accommodation. And then in this case, I will choose any of these, but in your case, you need to choose the correct institution where you are providing the accommodation. Okay? Now, on the campus, it's supposed to show you the campus which exists within here. Maybe let me choose a university which has good campuses. Let's say that one. And then here it's supposed to give me the correct campuses which exist here. Unfortunately, we haven't added that. So I'm going to leave it blank, but the point is that University of Limpopo is the university where we'll be providing accommodation. And then from there, we'll be required to enter the city. So automatically it picks up the city, automatically it picks up the province, because we know where this university is. And now what is critical as well is to indicate the distance where the property is located from the university. So maybe of the sake I'm going to put 3 kilometers from the university. Then my next thing is I will say proceed, but it cannot allow me because I haven't indicated the campus. So for this sake, I've chosen my institution and I've chosen my campus and the township as well as the province here are auto-populated. Please take note that my environment is a test environment and therefore some of the data may not be available. But on the respective portal, you will find all the information is available for you there, okay? Now I'm going to go ahead to continue. And the moment I continue, it presents me with the amenities as well as the features which are available at my property. So in this case, I'm required to choose which of these properties are available. And in my case, I'm going to take you through just clicking which properties are available. And now, these will be the ones which the accreditor will be looking for during the time of accreditation. Now, the last part is the overall listing conditions. This one, it gives an idea because you own this property, you know it well, and you know in what conditions it is. And therefore, what we're asking of you here is, can you briefly describe your property? Is it in excellent condition? Is it in very good condition? Is it good or very good, or is it poor? We would like you to be honest there because we will have an expectation when we'll be doing your what? Your accreditation. So for example, my property is very good, and then I proceed to the next stage. My next stage is asking me to upload the photos, the media, as well as the plans which I have for my building. In this case, I can choose any picture that is available to me, but at the same time, I may not be able to undo this one later. But in your case, we would like you to upload a picture that actually tells more about your building, be it the outside and the inside. We are also interested most in to know what is it that we see from the outside, because that's where we are welcomed more. So let me use a test image here. I'm going to choose this image and use it as a test image for me. Now, in this case, you are allowed to crop it and show the part that you want. I'll leave it as default. So the moment I upload that, it will appear here as my image. And if you upload 3, 4, 5, 10 images, those images will be available as well. And you can actually change to be, okay, I want this one to be my cover page. You are allowed to do that. So let's give it a sec so that it can complete the uploading. Alright, my my image is successfully uploaded into the system, and the next thing is I can upload a video in this case. So I'm going to upload this video. So in your case, you may be required to take a short video if you want, so that people can see, and then you say, okay, this is how my place looks like. And the people have a better idea of how your property is. It sheds more light into that. And then in the same point, I can also upload the plan diagram that I have for the property. Just waiting for a little bit for the uploading to complete. Alright, so my video is as well uploaded. I can play it here to preview my information and how it looks like. Now I'm gonna go ahead to say continue. Now, the other critical item is here, where now we have the plans. You can upload them here if you like, but in my case, I'm just going to choose any image in this case and just upload it here, and then they say upload. Okay. Right, that one I'm done, and it shows me I've uploaded the file successfully. And then I'm going to the next one, is now to review the information of my listing. In the information here, it states your accommodation name, the type of ownership, the address where you are, the space type, the room type, the number of rooms, the number of beds are there, the number of bathrooms, the university where we're providing the accommodation, the campus, the city, as well as the province where it is, and the distance from the institution. Lastly, we would like now to see, okay, in this case, how are we determining this? So you'll be required now to know, say our listing beds is 100. After 100, you have now the price of beds for this one, and then you can also check the prices here for your accreditation purposes. All right, now in my case here, I will not be able to calculate anything to cause any problem. But what is critical from this point, from your end, is that you are able to say, no, I would like to request accreditation later, or I would like to request accreditation now. The moment I say request accreditation now, it will prompt me to make payment. And now it's making say, okay, I would like to make instant payment, and then you can proceed accordingly from there. Otherwise, if you don't want, you can go ahead to say, no, okay, I'm gonna pay later, and at that moment it will take you through to your listing. That is all about the AP registration as well as the listing of your property.
There's a navigation on the left-hand side that is available to the accreditors, but in essence, the accreditors would want to then have a look at what applications have come through. So this dashboard provides them a view of all the accreditation applications that have been made. So I'm also on a simulated dev environment. This is, or rather a demo environment. This is not in production. So these numbers are just for demonstration purposes. There's a view of what applications have come through. There's a view of what students also have come through to the process from an application point of view, and payments that have been submitted. There's users that are in the system that this administration side allows to administer, and also the view of rooms that have been captured on the system. So the area that I would like to zoom in on is in terms of how the system has been configured. So the process, as I state, it is an ecosystem. It's an ecosystem of various participants coming together, engaging and improving on the process. So we are walking the journey as a collective and looking at ways and means to standardize on the different aspects of accreditation, and ultimately to arrive at a common understanding from you as the accommodation provider, and the expectations from NSFAS in terms of how then do we rate and grade the different establishments. So whilst on the capturing side, you would state the condition that you see your property as, there's still the objective view that will be taken by the accreditor to come through and look at all the various aspects of the property, and then ultimately how those will then contribute to the overall grading of the property. And it is important to stress that grading is for the property. So you don't grade a room. You don't look at one room and call this one room a 5-star and ignore all the other rooms and expect a different rating or pricing for that room. All accommodation is for the entire property. That's something that it needs to be emphasized for accommodation providers. As we walk the journey of standardizing the process, we then agree on what rating would be implemented for the various establishments. And then the most critical aspect of it comes where we come in to evaluate the property. So when the property is captured by the accommodation provider, all that information then comes through to this particular dashboard. So as the accreditor, the person responsible for overseeing the various areas of establishments that have to be accredited, we're able to go and fetch all new records that have been created on the system and start the process of running them through the various stages of assessment. So there's two essential stages from an accreditation point of view. The first stage is when an appointment is made between the accreditor and yourselves as an AP to come through and view the property and go through the checklist as in the assessment. That's the first part. The second part is then all that information then is brought back to the back office, and in there the final accreditation is then finalized. And if there are any issues that are deemed missing that needs to be addressed, it is then taken care of from this stage. So for any accommodation that has been submitted, all the information that was captured from the registration point of view is available to the assessor. It's available in terms of the address and so forth, what documents have been provided, the various photos that have been put in, and the profile of the property. So this would be a profile giving a view of how many rooms are there, the total beds that are there, depending on the configuration of the system as it stands. And crucially, which campuses has this particular property been linked with. So at the time of registering your property, you link that property with the actual institution and the campus. You can have multiple campuses, so you're not limited to just one campus, and you can even have multiple universities or institutions rather that you want to provide services to. So in terms of the evaluation, this is where from what was captured on the registration side is then verified. So this is basically the confirmation stage, and as I said, the assessor is there on site. The assessor is there walking through the property and looking at all the various facilities and amenities that are there, and ensuring that they confirm all that has been captured is rightfully there. The whole process then is also validated against an evaluator checklist, things that these are configurable. These are things that we will be picking up as we go through the journey and walking the journey with the accreditor, with the accreditors, in terms of what else needs to be applied onto the accreditation process in order to enrich the experience. So one thing that I'll have to always make mention when it comes to accreditation is that there's a norms and standards. So we're guided by this particular document that is in essence the standard that we all base ourselves on. So when you have a room that is meant to qualify for a single room. All the specifications are there, and it is stressed that everyone needs to be aware of what this document has. So when you're as an accommodation provider, you need to be aware of what you're rated against, and this would help you to really understand that information. So in terms of the assessment, it's all captured on the system, and there's a part where we also engage back and forth between the portal and the AP. That's the feedback aspect of things. So if there's any communication that needs to be had, please clarify this, or please provide additional documentation pertaining to your property. That is this step of providing feedback and requesting information from the accommodation provider. The last step would be then, once the assessment has been taken, has been executed, we've had the assessor going to site. This information once more gets verified, and it's the final step of giving the accreditation and the thumbs up in terms of what has been captured, what has been seen, verified, and what then would the student expect when applying for residence in this particular establishment. So again, it's a desktop exercise of validating all that information, seeing the relationship between the property. That is my home, guys. So there is a view of what is the distance between the property that has been uploaded and the institution. So you can specify whether it is a walking distance, you can specify whether it's driving, and ultimately this will give a view of what the expectation is for the student, and the final evaluation, as it was captured from the assessment, is viewed, and depending on how the accreditation was finalized, upon submission of this accreditation step, then we'll give a grading of the property. This is an objective process, so it's not about favoring one AP to the other, but it's based on standards. So when we now go and have a common understanding and a common view of what is configurable from an accreditation point of view, is to make the process seamless and fair to everyone that is a service provider in this process. That is basically the key functionalities that I wanted to run through from an accreditation point of view. So we are simulating a student experience. So from the portal point of view, the student is given an opportunity to apply. So there are two instances of, or rather two ways that students would be created onto the platform. The one is we would have a relationship of and knowledge of the NSFAS student that is funded, and we would then pull that information onto the portal. But the portal is also meant to expand its reach to students that are not NSFAS student, but that's a scope and feature that we are building in and going through the experience of implementing onto our platform. But the essence of the system would be to allow the students to start the process of applying. They would need to specify a student number. I'm going to use fictitious information, the type of room that they want to have. They can specify documents that they want to upload. Key document would be the proof of registration. That was, in essence, the application process. What I'd gone through is an application that already exists. That is why that information was already pre-populated. But just to take you back, they would specify the year of study, term, institution that they want to go into. So as demonstrated earlier from a registration point of view, where the accommodation is linked to a institution and the campus, that information is also accessible to the student to say, what institution do I want to go to, which campus do I want to study at? And because of that, there are accommodations that are available and linked to that particular institution. That is how you arrive at this screen where you then specify the student number and the rooms and so forth. So what I had gone through was an existing application where additional information was essentially captured. So the student is in control of this journey. They know the places that are there, and they're able to then submit their details. And crucially, as I stated, it is the proof of registration that is then shared with the AP, that is shared with NSFAS, and enriching the process of ensuring that the students that are being provided for and captured in the portal are students that have already gone through the registration process. It's another way where the portal as an ecosystem enriches the information that is available for the student experience. One other features that I just want to quickly touch on, they are able to view the various applications and the status thereof. So they can go in and see what has happened. They can reapply, and they can see statuses where they've been rejected for application. They're able to make queries. You would recall earlier where walking into an accommodation and finding that the rooms that have been presented are not exactly what the student is expecting. This feedback form allows the student to also enrich that knowledge of what the accommodations are, the state of the accommodation, and ultimately to be able to rate the various accommodations. So they can provide for clarity, for queries, they can rate those properties, and that feedback enriches once more the information that is captured around the accommodations and the establishments that this portal is overseeing. The last two would be where ultimately there is an agreement that has been reached between the accommodation provider and the student. A lease is in place, and once this lease is in place, that's what activates the payment process, as was discussed in the first half of the presentation. So depending on what the rate of the particular room is, or the bed per se, that information is captured on the lease agreement, and this enriches the process of payment that are then facilitated by NSFAS. And lastly, it's just a view of the different accommodations that one is interested in as a student. That is the journey that the student will go through. So this matches ultimately the accommodation provider journey, the student journey, and enriching that experience for the student at the end of the day.
But let me try to respond to some of the issues, and I hope that we will cover the gist of your questions. So I'm hearing the accreditation period. How long, when do you start, how far will we go? It's an open-ended process. So there's not going to be a start and an end date. As soon as, or as long as there are new potential accommodation providers coming
onto the portal and updating their accommodation to be available to students. We'll list that accommodation, we'll verify, so there's no start and end. Our intention is 1, to build stock, and 2, to enable the market forces to regulate themselves. Another important question that was asked was, how is a student practically going to choose? And I think technically you can help me with that, right? But the idea is expose to students on the student service portal what is available for their institution in their campus, around their campus, so that as a student I can at least view what is there. Just like most or all of us, when we go property 24 and we are looking for a place to rent, we have that choice. It's not the university that's going to choose. It's not NSFAS that's going to choose for the student. The student will make a choice. But that choice is based on whatever that the student is feeling. It goes with what they need. And depending on the availability or non-availability of that particular facility, you'll decline or accept the student. Then the student must be able to go to the second choice. I think we said there should be, at least they should be able to choose three properties, understanding that the first choice may not always be available. So that is how they are then going to choose. Then you look at their credentials. Do you want the student to, are you happy? They accept, you accept them. They say, go ahead, I accept the space. And then we can generate the lease agreement, send the lease agreement to you and sign the lease agreement. Then run the administration process on the back end of the NSFAS. The other question that is asked is, there's no support to yourself as accommodation providers where you experience technical glitches on the system or any other matter really related to the project you don't find us very structured in terms of how we support you. I think that is a very important aspect that we need to take home. So there's a new initiative, colleagues. What we ordinarily have is a structured service for our students that we are now trying to compartmentalize according to the new products that are coming on board. We should be almost done with that process to see on our existing call center resources, how can we assign some to just focus on the accommodation, and then while we keep the rest of them focused to deal with student funding queries and any other place. So we are looking at that setup and also trying to identify people that understand the process and they can actually give you proper responses when you are having difficulties. But what is immediate is to really get the questions from yourselves, that we sit through those questions, put up FAQ on the website so that you can see it readily available. And possibly in there we'll also put the contact center number so that you can also reach out to them. By then we should hopefully identify resources that can then support student accommodation. Why are we paying? Because government does not pay for this service of accreditation and it has to pay for itself. And the costs were also outlined, I suppose, on the website. When you get onto the website, you are able to see for this number of beds, you have to pay this much for bed. And I do understand it is also an established process within our universities to be paid. So if that's not the case for NSFAS, it's not funded, and therefore the accreditors have to be paid for one way or the other to go and do the work. It's not work that is in the allocated funds of NSFAS. Is there anything I'm missing that you can take?
All right, I'll run through some of the questions and we'll just share these the responses with my colleague. So there was a question around listing students. It's been touched on briefly. It's when I go through the demo and I run quickly through it, there is a place for the student to select the institution and their accommodation type, and they'll get a listing and a view of all the properties, so they can then select, choose which one that they want to apply for. It's a feature that I didn't run through right at the end. There was a question around APIs, sharing of APIs. This is a continuously evolving process. We're going to be learning through the journey. We appreciate that. And if there's input to enrich the process, to share qualitative data, to make the process much easier, ultimately to make the experience for yourselves as APs easier, the experience of the student easier, we would appreciate that feedback. And yes, we are always open to engage to see how we can add value to that process. So it is a continuous engagement. The questions around the accreditation process, it's been answered. It's a continuous process, and I value that the FAQ is something that has been discussed, and a lot of the questions that have been raised would actually be answered through that FAQ. There was one point that was very emotive when it was raised, and that was on the question of bribes. We looking to standardize the process and make it as objective as possible. So that means it's all based on configurable, measurable input. So when the assessor goes to site and goes through the process of assessing your property, and you receive feedback from that system, there is a process of responding with queries, or even to lodge a complaint around that process. So that is something that has been discussed, and it will be part of the journey. So we're looking at making it as objective as possible. But again, input from your side, yourselves, would also be appreciated.
Just to add more on what my colleague has said, I just want to tackle two questions, if not three. First of all is regarding listing your space. There's a question asked about choosing multiple campuses. So around that, we are under the assumption that you're providing accommodation to a specific institution. But at the same time, we do understand that that accommodation can be used by different kind of students in the same building. So for us to add multiple campuses, you'll be governed by the region, the address, and also the distance between the institution and your property. I don't know if that answered the question, but you are allowed to add campuses which can be used for that particular accommodation. Another question was asked about adding multiple properties to, like maybe adding multiple properties, listing multiple properties. Now, I as an accommodation provider, and I'm registered, I should be able to list my properties. If I have 10 properties, I have to individually list those properties, because I don't think the same property, 10 properties are named by the same, no. Secondly, they are not at the same address, no. They may not have the same number of rooms or number of beds. So we are treating each property and we are taking as it is. Therefore, we treat each property separately. Therefore, it has to be uploaded or listed on the portal separately. So under your account, you can list as many properties as you like. The ones you have can be listed. I hope that answered the question. Also, I just want to add a little bit on the part which my colleague shared regarding the bribes. So, it's an experience which we go through, and it's not a good one. And we are trying to come up with some enhancements.
So, colleagues, I just want to close the matter on fraud and corruption. As a government entity, as we will not be asking any bribes from any accommodation provider. We don't want any accommodation provider to give our students bribes to go to get to their residences. Any of the accreditors that ask for money from yourselves, you must report them. That is why this whole process is transparent. We must not leave this room even leaving the space for any form of underhandedness upwards. That is why this process is as open as this. You must report anybody that comes to you to say, well, I can accredit for you for free, immediately report that person. Whether it's an NSFAS employee, it's an accreditor, or it's a person. No tolerance for that at all for this process. I just want to take this opportunity to thank all of you for these honest conversations that we have had today.